something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to the Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today we are joined again by Sam Husseini, an independent journalist currently writing at husseini.substack.com. He has written extensively about Palestine and international law. Last year, he repeatedly wrote about the possibility of a country invoking the Genocide Convention against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Husseini regularly attends State Department briefings, asking tough questions. Other political interests of Sam Husseini include geopolitics, major media, and big tech, weapons of mass destruction, and COVID origins. Sam Husseini is senior analyst at the Institute for Public Accuracy. He's also the founder of votepact.org, which encourages left-right cooperation to undermine the establishment duopoly. I encourage everyone to subscribe to Sam Husseini's Substack. In the show notes, we have links to Substack articles, including those that we are discussing today, so please check those out. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. If you want to see this episode in its entirety, and if you want to have access to what we have sought to make the most scholarly and useful podcast collection of deep political and historical analysis, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception, and it's in the show notes. This month, we began our new Gray Alliance series, which looks at the Lansky Syndicate, CIA, Mossad threads running through the JFK assassination, Watergate, and beyond. If you appreciate this kind of material, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Sam Husseini, it's great to have you back.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Aaron.
So you have been writing about U.S. foreign policy and about different sort of political scandals, really, and interesting articles of late that I want to get into. But first, is there anything that you would, for people that have been halfway following Gaza, or maybe follow the elections and then and at some point are even tired of even trying to keep up with things with Gaza because it's so grim. What would you say is the state of things right now? Like, is this the grimmest moment that you can recall here, or are there signs of anything that makes you optimistic, whether at the UN or within the region?
It's very grim now, and it could possibly get worse, or I mean, there are some indications that Trump wants it to wind down, kind of 1980 election, with the hostages, that kind of thing. My concern is that these transition periods are always incredibly, or can be very unstable. We can get into a couple of examples of that. But I mean, right now, the realities are that Israel is ethnically cleansing more and more of especially northern Gaza, and indicating that they want to annex the West Bank, obviously without giving voting rights to the Palestinians there, and they're continuing their attacks on Lebanon. Attacking Syria. Israel has recently attacked Syria recently as well. So that's the state of actual affairs. The UN failed in its responsibility to follow up meaningfully with the orders from the International Court of Justice. They did pass a resolution following up on some of the rulings from the court, but they didn't have any teeth. Sanctions, arms embargo, and so on, which is what the UN did in the South Africa case, for example. But people are still pushing for that in various quarters, including direct protests in New York. I would hope that those protests would take off. For example, student protesters should join in that if they're in New York. To directly take their grievances to the doorstep of the U.S. mission, Israeli mission, and other missions to the UN. A lot of countries posture as trying to stop Israel, but don't actually do much of anything. And pressure on that front seems to be working. People targeted the Turkish embassies recently, and then Turkey cut off relations with Israel. I don't know that they've ended all economic ties, which was the main demand. But it's up to people to be petitioning, not just petitioning, to be massively pressuring, not just the US and Israeli and German governments who are directly culpable, and British, but also other countries. A lot of other countries can do a hell of a lot more than what they're doing. On the legislative front, Sanders is making a move finally in Congress. It's very similar to what he did 2021. In 2021, Israel was bombing Gaza, and he put forward a resolution of disapproval regarding weapons to Israel. And immediately after he said he was going to do that, the bombing stopped. Now, I don't know if those two things are related, but that's what happened in 2021. The timing of events were such. And he's dragged his heels and trying to do the same thing again, this time for more than a year. He's finally doing it. I don't know if it's going to have a similar effect or not, but it's something that's good and that he should have done a long time ago. Other thing that can and should be done is war powers, and beyond that, impeachment. I mean, the U.S. is an open violation of war powers resolution. With bombing Yemen without authorization, because the Yemenis are trying to stop Israel's genocide, so they're bombing targets, and so the U.S. is directly bombing Yemen without.
Also, the Syrian invasion and occupation is clearly that would be clear violation of the War Powers Act, right? I mean, there was never any authorization for that except for authorizing covert action, but that doesn't,
Right. Right.
I mean, I guess, are they saying that the 9/11 measures somehow give?
I don't think that they can do that because they're targeting Assad. No one claims that Assad is tied to Al Qaeda.
But they say they're not. They say that they're there to fight ISIS. But everybody knows that they basically created an ISIS sanctuary. I mean, it's the most preposterous thing. But I think that they're saying that they're there to fight ISIS, and that it's justified by the authorization of the use of military force after 9/11, something crazy like that. Maybe the pretext.
I think that some of their targeting is, the stated goal is vis-a-vis Syria and Iran and so on. Yeah. But I think there are two layers of things at least going on there. And the other thing is sending 100 U.S. troops to Israel. Where if Iran does strike back at Israel, will likely be targeted by Iran. So that right there is a war powers violation. So if a member of Congress actually believed in the Constitution, they would move on that.
Do you think that this idea of the tripwire troops and the troops that are in Israel there manning these defense systems, and everybody, at least people that are knowledgeable, seem to understand that the missile defenses can be overwhelmed by Hezbollah and Iranian missiles at this point. So there's this tripwire there, but the U.S. would be a disaster for the U.S. to actually attack Iran. I mean, that seems to be the consensus of people that understand the military situation, and also the relationship between the military, the Persian Gulf oil and all of that the relationship of that to the global dollar-based economy. This is where it seems that they're at a crossroads, but any escalation of this or any entry by the U.S. would seem to be doomed to fail unless you just nuke everyone. But Russia wouldn't. I don't think Russia would stand for that. So, I mean, do you have any sense from talking to people around Washington that this has to somehow wind down, or how do they see this resolving?
Well, I mean, Trump's appointments are very hawkish on Iran, so that doesn't indicate that they want to wind down. There could potentially be deal making behind the scenes. They could be threatening Iran and hoping that Iran backs away from supporting the axis of resistance. It's pure speculation on my end at this point. And I mean, failure for the U.S., I think, is for the U.S. establishment is an amorphous thing. A lot of people make a hell of a lot of money and benefit in a lot of ways from wars that are, on the surface level failures. So I don't know if that's part of what they're thinking. But I don't, other than speculating for half an hour, I really don't have great insight.
Yeah, it's this scary thing that there doesn't seem to be anybody really at the helm. I want to talk about some of the articles that you've written recently, including, I guess we could start with this one on, I'll just put it up here for a moment, but you have this article, Israel, Blackmail, and the Presidents. Samuel Passar, Blinken's stepfather, was Epstein's legal advisor, as well as Robert Maxwell. And you have a good amount of, these connections of the people here. But how long have you been aware of the Blinken family ties to the higher circles of Zionism? Really, what's the significance of this?
Well, I was aware that his stepfather was lawyer to Maxwell, who, of course, is the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Epstein's co-conspirator in what we think was a not just pedophile ring, but a blackmail ring.
That seems to be the bigger issue, right? He wasn't. Nobody is saying he was making money as a pimp,
right.
So what was it for?
Right. Yeah, I think that the young female victims were sort of the almost collateral damage. That they were the criminal mechanism for the wider goal of gaining leverage over powerful people on behalf of the CIA. And I hope that people are more entertained than annoyed by the light is just coming in here. I usually don't do interviews at this time. And
the thing is, the people, the lives that they would ruin about this. If you understand what U.S. foreign policy has done and the methods that they've used, Western imperialism in general, these are people who have to be pretty much indifferent to human life in many respects. So it's like the people that are so shocked by this, and it's like, I don't even understand. The blackmail is to get people is typically to get politicians to do things that are even more evil and damaging than the actual sex trafficking stuff. It's like it's so much worse than Epstein's sexual blackmail stuff. That's the scary thing to wrap your mind around.
Right. There's no ethical limit on what the establishment is capable of doing. You see it every day if you're paying attention to Gaza. They are slaughtering children on a day in, day out basis. They put out a line that Hamas beheaded babies so that they could behead thousands of babies. That is what the system, especially the sort of U.S. Israeli aspect of it, is perfectly capable of doing. So the idea that they would be involved with, sex trafficking of
that would be wrong. It would be immoral.
Is a very one of their lesser horrific crimes.
Yeah.
So,
And Blinken, let's go back to Blinken. This guy it has been a disaster as a Secretary of State, and I think is it Jeff Sachs or Mearsheimer that just describes him as Netanyahu's lawyer. I mean, this is the most pathetic the U.S. has ever seemed in my opinion. Just in that, as much as there were many lies and things that were covert empire that's denied, and there's always this whole tapestry of lies about the U.S. Since the end of World War II, but it hasn't been as absurd as Blinken and these other clowns basically just say, I mean, the metaphor, pick your metaphor, but just they're pissing on the world and telling the world that it's raining. I've never seen it this where there's not even the side that the establishment is arguing is not remotely defensible by anyone with half a brain.
Yeah, I think that's true, but they are basically getting away with it. As you know, I sort of lay out in my chart and article here, Maurice Blinken founded the American Palestine Institute, and at a critical time, they put out a paper talking about arguing the British had assessed that Israel was not a viable state economically, and they put out a paper saying that it was, and that was apparently pivotal in the U.S. recognizing Israel. That's Blinken's grandfather. His stepfather.
And there was also a big contribution, as I understand it, to Harry Truman right around that, like before, and that led to him being able to win the election and upset Dewey.
Right. There were all kinds of other people connecting to and trying to influence, like the Massey thing about, handlers, AIPAC handlers. And so there was a sort of a precursor to that, of a whole bunch of Zionists around Truman urging him to recognize Israel. Although it's funny, like if you look at each of these presidents, they often later say some level of regret over it. Truman later on would talk about Palestinian refugees, that they should be brought back, and so on. That was one of the conditions of Israel being let into the UN, which basically created Israel. So that's sort of a sidelight. But you had Pizarro, who's his Blinken's stepfather, was, as is widely known, the lawyer and some would say consigliere to Robert Maxwell, who has been repeatedly described, and I think fairly well established, as an Israeli quote-unquote super spy. Yeah. And he was apparently the last person to speak to him on the phone when he died on his yacht.
It seems to have been murdered.
Yeah, correct. But what I didn't know until recently is that after that, Pizarro then became either lawyer or the in-between between Epstein and his lawyers. This is based on articles in the French press. So that's remarkable, that you, and of course, Epstein's list, you have lots of people flying around on his Lolita Express, and no one's been put away, and you have a whole litany of influential men from Bill Clinton to Robert Kennedy to Ehud Barak to Bill Richardson, a whole ton of people who were very influential in terms of setting policy, who potentially were being blackmailed by Epstein. He was funded by Les Wexner, who was part of a thing called the Mega Group, which was a group of influential Zionists in the United States. Wexner got gave him his very fancy digs in Manhattan, where he apparently had surveillance equipment. So this just leaves a whole series of questions. And Blinken's relationship with Biden is longstanding, right? He was the staffer for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the head staffer, when Biden was chairperson of that and held hearings that basically paved the way for the invasion of Iraq, which of course was a major goal of the U.S. and Israeli establishments. It was kind of laid out in the documents regarding from Richard Pearl and Company, excuse me.
And they were. I mean, Biden also was the person who put forward more aggressively than anyone else this plan to partition Iraq. I think he was the most high-profile backer of that plan, which now is clearly in line with Bibi and the clean break, strategy put forward by Bibi and Wolfowitz and Pearl, and I think David Wormser and Scooter Libby were a part of that. Scooter Libby is, of course, Mark Rich's lawyer. He got rich by working for Mark Rich, who was the oil smuggler, basically Israel's oil supplier. I mean, the corruption here is just it's staggering, really.
Right. I'd forgotten that last part. Yeah, I mean, that's why I don't necessarily view things as failures. I don't know that Blinken is failing. I think he's just pursuing an imperial policy that's criminal and heinous, and is certainly having a detrimental effect in terms of the reputation of Israel and the United States. But that's, a relatively small price to pay for them for getting away with murder, literally over and over again on at least an hourly basis.
I think it's as his nominal position, Blinken, as the Secretary of State for the U.S., and needing to, by virtue of his position, enact policies that will be in the national interest of the United States. And yes, the national interest is a kind of a crazy national interest that we've decided. The national interest is a unipolar empire, right? But this is where I feel that it has. This is where I would say that he is failing, like in that sense, because this has so damaged the U.S. But I agree he's doing what he intended to do. But it is, the things that you are laying out are related to how the Zionist oligarchs, collaborating with, Israeli intelligence and such, have been able to put people who are so into this greater Israel nutty version of this pipe dream, really, they're so committed to it that they will tank the U.S. reputation and potentially risk the U.S. position in the world in order to pursue this. This is how it seems to me, anyway. And I do think that it will damage the U.S. when Israel, if and when Israel does collapse. But the reason for that is that they were able to steer U.S. policy towards Israel in this way. It wouldn't have, if they'd pursued different policies, even policies like people like Reagan and H.W. Bush, I believe, actually wanted to pursue, then it wouldn't mean that. You know what I mean? It changes the whole calculus. Like, you don't have to go and beat up everyone in the region. You can bribe them. But the greater Zionist aspect of it seems to have forced them into these. And it's like a path-dependent thing. Now they kind of are more dependent on Israel in a sense because they've gone down the road they've gone on. And this is where what you're doing is illuminating and horrifying here.
Yeah, I mean, they have bribed a fair number of people. I mean, the governments of Jordan and Egypt and others, and the much touted Abraham Accords, where they basically, made deals with a bunch of Arab governments to normalize relationships with Israel, therefore isolating the Palestinians, which was a long-term Israeli goal. So what I see, and that was largely done by the Trump administration, but totally continued hand in glove with the Biden administration. There's, I think, remarkable continuity in U.S. policy, like in a sick symbiotic relationship where they build off of each other, and different administrations can do different things, right? Like the establishment, I think, long-term wanted to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Long term wanted to recognize the annexation of the Golan Heights. But you can have a conventional president do that, but you can have Donald Trump do that. So I think I was riffing about how different presidents do different things, and Trump was useful to the establishment for,
Yeah.
move to Jerusalem, Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Although other presidents
Yeah.
could have done the Abraham Accords, but
Right. Okay.
the annexations.
So let's think about this business, the fact that Blinken is there and he is such a diehard by, a pedigree and such, and his policies, he acts like Bibi's lawyer, as we've said. And so the Epstein connection should be very alarming in that, the Bill Clinton aspect to it. I mean, it seems like Bill Clinton's presidency, he was supposedly not this neocon, but he seemed to give a lot of leeway to neocons, and he seemed to do a number of things to cave to them. I mean, the Lewinsky thing happened, and it really, he bombed some of the same days of like around the same, key dates in those proceedings. He bombed Iraq and such. He ends up pardoning Mark Rich. He really lets the CIA run, or the Pentagon. I mean, we don't know exactly who's managing things, but you have the jihadi operations that are, in the Caucasus and the Balkans and so on during that time period. I mean, which party is not just completely corrupted by these forces?
Yeah, well, I mean, we know that both parties are corrupted. It's just not clear to what, most people say it's AIPAC money is the main mechanism, or alleged geostrategic interest. And I don't discount that those are major factors, but I think that we do have to examine this other factor. Yeah. And it was, reported that Israel was using the Lewinsky thing as blackmail against Clinton, especially vis-a-vis Pollard, getting him to pardon Pollard. And there's been some substantial work done on that. And, the elephant in the room regarding Blinken and Biden, especially them having known each other for a long time, is Biden's propensity to put it very mildly, touch, young females inappropriately. So is this a factor, or, is it purely ideological on the part of Biden that he's a diehard Zionist and I'm an Irish giant Zionist and all of this stuff? Or is there a whole other level to this that could well be tied to Blinken, given his pedigree and orientation, and so on? I don't have a definitive answer for that, but I think it's insane that this hasn't been seriously asked as a question.
I mean, it seems that his backers, whoever they are, he was able to ride their patronage all the way to the White House, even though it ended up being a really pathetic presidency. I wonder if he regrets ever having done it. I agree with you. They have it would seem that isn't to say I disagree with you. So, I mean, they have carrots and sticks of like blackmail on the one hand and ruin you, or you can, you're our guy, and
play ball. Why not?
Yeah, and it's, Obama is seen perhaps as being less hawkish on Israel than, say, McCain, who he ran against, and then George W. Bush, who preceded him, and probably Donald Trump as well. But then you look at Obama had, Rahm Emanuel as one of his, main people around him. And I tend to think that he's less on the neocon / super Zionist side and more on the corporate side. But to me, what it just shows is you're not going to be able to avoid, if you want to rise to high office in this, you have to accommodate these forces. Like, Obama, his right-hand man, was sort of fanatical son of a terrorist, right? Like a airgun
Rahm
terrorist.
Emanuel is a horrific record and is a hyper ultra militarist Zionist. He was actually partially responsible for sabotaging the campaign. I think he got a start way back. Paul Findlay. These moderate Republicans like Charles Percy in the 1970s were critical of AIPAC. And he helped sabotage some of their campaigns. That was like, I think, how he made some of his first chops. So you had effectively, Clinton and Obama pursue massively pro-Israeli policies. I should clarify the Obama thing was interesting in how it ended, especially from the UN perspective. Obama spent 8 years preventing the UN from doing anything critical of Israel. This is a remarkable achievement on behalf of Israel. Then at the very end of his administration, like Christmas of 2016, they finally let a UN resolution through criticizing Israeli settlements. And that is what triggers much of what people call Russiagate. Because what happens then is that Kushner gets Flynn, would be Trump's incoming national security advisor, to call up the Russians to try to get them to delay that vote until after Trump gets into the White House in January the following month, so that they could veto it. So they weren't doing the Russians a favor. They were pressing the Russians to do the Israelis a favor. So that's one of many strands in that story that points to it being Israelgate and not Russiagate.
You can watch the rest of this episode by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. In the second half of this video, we discuss some of the subject matter in our new American Exception podcast series, Gray Alliance. So if you want to hear the rest of this discussion with Sam, and if you want to hear the Gray Alliance series itself, which looks at the Lansky Syndicate, CIA, Mossad threads that run through the JFK assassination, Watergate, and beyond, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/American Exception. There's a link in the show notes. As for this YouTube video or the podcast on SoundCloud, please like, share, subscribe, and all that. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Please check the show notes for links to Sam Husseini's Substack, including the articles we discussed today. Sam is a Palestinian-American journalist, so this must be a terribly difficult time for him. I really respect him for being able to continue to produce journalism under these grim and tragic circumstances. I find it horrifying myself, so I can only imagine what it would be like if I had a deep personal connection to the people and places where these horrors are unfolding. So let me close by saying that we need to make true the lies that the West tells itself, and it's about itself and its supposed enlightenment. We need to create a world where neither the Palestinians nor any other people are treated as pawns on the devil's chessboard.